Who's the host there?
Okay,
Linda Collins.
so I'm going to ask everyone to put themselves on mute if they can. And I just want to remind people about the option of going to view in the upper right-hand corner and selecting to key in on the speaker if you wish to have speaker view so that you can see Madeline up close and personal in our Zoom format here. Our schedule for tonight is Madeline's going to speak, and then we're going to ask her some questions that you had submitted earlier when you signed on for the webinar. So to get started, I'm Linda Collins. I'm the director of the Falmouth Public Library and a member of Falmouth Reads Together committee. The Falmouth Reads Together has been selecting a book for the community to read ever since 2008. And I want to thank all the members of the committee that are here: Tammy Ammond, Joanna Brianna Gardner, Carol Casey, Mary Fran Buckley, Krista Hennessy, and Russ Pelletier. This year's book is Circe by Madeline Miller, and we're thrilled to have Madeline Miller here to speak with us tonight. She has both an undergraduate and graduate degree in Latin and Ancient Greek from Brown University, and she's taught Latin, Greek, and Shakespeare to high school students. And as Mary Fran mentioned, you're happy to know that Circe is on the summer reading list for Falmouth high school students. It has been for a couple of years now, so that's a good thing. It's always a treat to hear from the author. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this Zoom presentation over to Madeline Miller.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here. It's such an honor. And I don't know if this had gone out, but my husband's family has connections to Falmouth, so I'm very excited. It's always especially nice because I feel like I'm sort of, family in law. I wanted to start by reading a very short passage from the novel, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to write the novel, and then go to questions. So the passage I'm going to read comes from towards the middle of the novel, after Circe, who is the daughter of the sun god Helios, has been exiled from her father's halls, landed on the magical island of Aiaia, where she will famously turn Odysseus's men into pigs. She has developed her witchcraft, which is quite separate from her divinity. She's, born a goddess, but she makes herself into a witch. And so in this passage, she has already started turning men into pigs, and she is talking to Odysseus. He asked me once, why pigs? We were seated before my hearth in our usual chairs. He liked the one draped in cowhide with silver inlaid in its carvings. Sometimes he would rub the scrolling absently beneath his thumb. Why not? I said. He gave me a bare smile. I mean it. I would like to know. I knew he meant it. He was not a pious man, but the seeking out of things hidden, this was his highest worship. There were answers in me. I felt them, buried deep as last year's bulbs growing fat. Their roots tangled with those moments I had spent against the wall, when my lions were gone, and my spells shut up inside me. After I changed a crew, I would watch them scrabbling and crying in the sty, falling over each other, stupid with their horror. They hated it all, their newly voluptuous flesh, their delicate split trotters, their swollen bellies dragging in the earth's muck. It was a humiliation, a debasement. They were sick with longing for their hands, those appendages men use to mitigate the world. Come, I would say to them, it's not that bad. You should appreciate a pig's advantages. Mud slick and swift, they are hard to catch. Low to the ground, they cannot easily be knocked over. They are not like dogs. They do not need your love. They can thrive anywhere, on anything, scraps and trash. They look witless and dull, which lulls their enemies, but they are clever. They will remember your face. They never listened. The truth is, men make terrible pigs. I always like to start with a reading because My inspiration for Circe was the Odyssey and Homer and the Iliad. And so the Iliad and the Odyssey, although we think of them now as books that you go to the bookstore to buy and things that you read, initially the Iliad and the Odyssey came out of oral tradition. They were stories that had been handed down that had been turned into poetry by bards and generations of bards. They were delivered before an audience, and people would go see them the way we might go see a play or we might go see a movie. They were entertainment. They were living and growing texts. In fact, they weren't even really texts. They weren't written down until later. And so there was this really strong oral component to them. And that they were things that had been developed out of years of storytellers telling them and changing them and audiences reacting to them. And so I do a lot, when I edit, I do a lot of reading out loud, and I really wanted both Circe and my first novel, Song of Achilles, to have sort of that oral presence to it. So I always like to start off with a little bit of a reading, just to kind of honor the Homeric tradition. Now, my first relationship with Greek mythology really started when I was around sort of 5 and 6 years old, which is when my mother, who was a librarian and an English major and a great lover of books and reading, started to read me pieces of the Iliad and the Odyssey as bedtime stories. She is now completely horrified that she did that. She thinks it was totally inappropriate. But I think she knew her daughter because I loved it. And I have a memory of her reading to me the first lines of the Iliad: "Sing, goddess of the destructive rage of Achilles," and just being completely hooked, thinking, who is this Achilles? Why is he so angry? And wanting to dive into this world. And I think part of what I loved about the world of Greek mythology is actually the same thing that I love about it now, which is that, you know, yes, there are these amazing fun monsters and there are gods and there are these fantastical elements, but it's also intensely human. That it's about parents and children and siblings and courage and pride and rage and terrible mistakes and sacrifice and love and family. I mean, it's about all these incredibly timeless and really potent human stories. So I continued to kind of throw myself into the world of Greek mythology. I was very fortunate that when I went to high school, I was able to take Latin. And I had a wonderful Latin teacher who saw that I was just in love with these stories, and he actually offered to teach me ancient Greek. I took him up on it in a flash. So I studied with him for about a year, and then we began reading the Iliad together. And I thought that I had loved these stories in translation, but getting to read the Iliad in the original ancient Greek was just a revelation for me. It was so electrifying. The prose, the poetry, the power of the language, it's so alive, it's so exciting. I mean, it was meant to hold, you know, an audience captive on the edge of their seats, and it does. And so I knew heading off to college that I wanted to continue to study ancient poetry, both Latin and Greek, and the classics. And I did, but my first sort of experience with Circe in particular actually goes back to 8th grade when I was 13 years old. And my English class read a translation of the Odyssey, and we studied it in English class. And this was really the first time, although I had been loving this mythology, that I had my own copy of the Iliad, and I was really reading it kind of start to finish by myself, you know, with the class. And it was really exciting. And I was in particular excited about this figure I had heard of in my Greek mythology travels, this woman named Circe, who was a witch who turned men into pigs. And that was because, as much as I loved the Greek myths, I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the female characters were a little bit flat. Oftentimes they were just names in the stories. They were this person's mother or this person's daughter or this person's wife. If their story was, you know, really exciting, they might get to die in it to motivate the male hero. But pretty much they were kept to the sidelines. And I would always sort of say like, oh, I'd like to know more about that character. Her story must be really interesting. And then I would try to look it up somewhere, and it's like, nope, that's only reference to her. That's it. That's all you get. And so I had this sort of frustration. There were a couple of the big, you know, villains in Greek mythology, women like Clytemnestra or Medea, who sort of cause destruction wherever they go. but they always had to be punished for their power by the end of their story. And so then there was this character of Circe who seemed to wield a fair amount of power, but didn't seem to be punished for it by the end of her story. So I was really drawn to that. And we finally got to, after I eagerly awaited the Circe chapter, we finally got to the Circe chapter in the Odyssey. And what happens is that Odysseus comes ashore with his men. They are in terrible, dire straits. When Odysseus leaves Troy, so he and his men have been at Troy for 10 years. They can't take the city. Finally, Odysseus comes up with the idea of the Trojan horse. They manage to break into the city of Troy. They sack the city. It was an ugly and brutal and horrible thing. And then Odysseus, as the architect of the fall of Troy, best of the Greeks, now that Achilles is dead, the great victor of the Trojan War, sails home as a hero. And 2 years later, after the fall of Troy, he's still not home. And in that time, from leaving Troy as this great hero, he has lost 11 of his 12 ships. So he has, lost men in the most horrifying ways. If any of you remember the Odyssey or have read the Odyssey, you may know the Cyclops, cannibals. It's just death upon death upon death. So when he lands on Circe's island, he lands there with only one ship and the men who are left. They're traumatized, they're exhausted, they're at the end of their rope. And then here they are in this lush island. Odysseus sends some men to go find out who lives there, hoping that maybe they can get help from this person, and maybe even they could steal from that person if the person won't help them willingly. Odysseus is very much of this sort of, we love him today. He's this beloved figure that is often very celebrated, but in the Odyssey, he's oftentimes pretty much just a glorified pirate. He looks to take stuff everywhere he goes. And in fact, the newest translation of the Odyssey by the brilliant scholar Emily Wilson, I would highly recommend her translation to everyone. I think it's awesome and so smart. She actually calls the chapter where he visits the Cyclops, the pirate and the shepherd. That's Odysseus, the pirate, and the Cyclops, the shepherd. And that's very true. He sort of loots wherever he goes. So anyway, we don't quite know what the intentions of his men are towards whoever lives on this island, but they come to this beautiful palatial home and they find these tame lions and wolves hanging out in the garden, a little disturbing. But they go up to the door and they knock on it, and they're greeted by a beautiful goddess who welcomes them into her house, who gives them food and wine. Turns out this is Circe. She's drugged the wine. She casts a magical spell and turns them into pigs and drives them out to her sty. So now Odysseus has to go and confront her. And on his way to go confront her, the god Hermes comes in the Odyssey and says to him, this witch Circe is actually quite a powerful witch. So I'm going to give you some herbs that will make you immune to her spells. So armed with these herbs, Odysseus goes to confront Circe. And this was the moment that as a 13-year-old, I was really excited about, because I thought, well, this is going to be a great scene. He's smart and complicated. She's smart and complicated. There's going to be like a battle of wits. There's going to be some good banter. This is going to be really exciting. They're going to join forces. What's going to happen? But what actually happens in that moment in the Odyssey is Circe tries to turn him into a pig. It doesn't work. Then he pulls his sword on her and threatens her. And she screams, falls to her knees, begs for mercy, and invites him into her bed in basically one speech. And as a 13-year-old, I can remember being so mad. I thought, that's it. Literally, she has to be put on her knees in front of the male hero. And I understood, this is Odysseus's story. She's the obstacle. He's on his hero's journey. He has to overcome her. But it just felt like, in that moment, such a missed opportunity. I thought, can't we just keep the camera on Circe a little bit longer? And I didn't know that very strong feeling that I had would eventually become this novel several decades later, but it did. And then the other thing that sort of got me thinking about Circe, aside from wanting more of her, was when I was an older student, I returned to the Odyssey many more times because I ended up in sort of graduate school and college specializing in ancient epic. And what I thought about Cersei as an older student was actually that I thought Cersei had gotten a really unfairly bad reputation in later versions of her story. That Cersei, if you look at sort of post-Homeric versions of her story, is often treated just as a straight up villain. She's treated as a man-hater, as an evil, seductive witch. She's like a spider at the center of her web, luring men in. It's sort of all this evilness. The scene where Aeneas has to pass by Circe's island in the Aeneid, it's like a horror movie. It's like, oh, don't go in that island. You know, that's where the evil lives. And so it was very interesting to me because I thought, well, that's really not the Homeric Cersei. In Homer, after that moment where she and Odysseus come to an understanding, they become lovers. And Circe says to him, I see that you and your men are exhausted. Stay on my island and heal as long as you need to. And Odysseus takes her up on it. He stays on her island for the next year. And in fact, at the end of the year, he doesn't want to leave. And this is really significant because Odysseus spends the whole Odyssey agitating to get home to Ithaca, where his wife is waiting for him and his son is waiting for him. His son, who was just a baby when he left for the Trojan War, and by the time he gets home is, 21 years old. He's missed his entire childhood and young adulthood. So he really has a strong reason to want to get home. But he doesn't want to leave Circe's island. His men have to come to him and say, it's time to get going. And he says, okay. And he goes to Circe. He says, I'm ready to leave. And she says, great, here's what you need to know. You're going to have to call this dead prophet out of the underworld and talk to him before you can continue on your journey. So here's how you have to do that. I'm going to give you some sacrificial animals so you can perform the right ritual. Then you're going to pass by some monsters. Here's how you get past them. And she starts unloading this really specific and incredibly vital, helpful, witchy knowledge that he basically couldn't get from anyone else except for someone like Circe. And so I thought, well, that's really interesting. Not only is she not a villain, but she's one of the most helpful characters that he encounters in the entire Odyssey. And so I loved the fact that she has this sort of interesting ambiguity that yes, she's frightening, but she is also benevolent and healing and helpful. And so I wanted to sort of bring that back to her. As it came time for me to start writing the book, I did a deep dive into all the references to Circe in the ancient mythology. I sort of wanted to kind of pick through them, and it's like they're little seeds, and I never know what's going to germinate, but I want to get them all in and kind of let them develop in my mind. And there were a couple things that kept jumping out at me, in particular from the Odyssey, but not only from the Odyssey. And one of them was this description of her in Homer as being the dread goddess who speaks like a human. And that just really stuck with me. I kept thinking, well, what does that mean to be a goddess who speaks like a human? And part of what I love to do when I write back to myths is I love to really dig into the psychology of them, because myths themselves, I think, imply psychology. There's a lot of implied psychology in the Greek mythology, but it isn't ever, the Hamlet soliloquy. It's not ever really spelled out. We're not living inside a character's head, sort of following each emotional change that they go through. So that's kind of what I like to bring to the myths, is to really dig inside a character. And I thought, well, what would it be like to be born a goddess in the halls of Helios, the god of the sun, but to speak like a human? And I began to think, well, what's the difference between speaking like a god and speaking like a human? And in the ancient world, when gods speak to you, it shakes the earth beneath your feet, and your blood runs cold, and all the strength drains out of your body, and your hair stands on end, and you fall to your knees. And if it's Zeus who's speaking to you and he doesn't shield his power from you, you might actually just incinerate in front of him. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. So she doesn't speak like that, but she grows up around people who do. And then I began to think, well, what are the gods like in general? And if you know the ancient mythology, you know that if we were going to, diagnose them in a modern context, we would call the gods sociopathic narcissists. They are incredibly selfish, cruel, vicious, capricious. If you offend them, they will punish you and your children and your children's children, basically until some other god or the fates make them stop. And so I thought, well, this is really interesting. So what would it be like to grow up among these people who value power above all, but to not have any power in your voice? Well, you would be an outcast. You would sort of live at the margins. And so immediately I started thinking about Circe as this character who was living at the margins, who was kind of caught between worlds. She was born a goddess, but she has a piece of her that yearns for the world of humans. And as I was thinking about the narcissism of the gods, I was thinking about the humanity of the humans that she sees. And the humanity, the humans that Circe meets in the novel are definitely too, which is its own piece of humanity. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that she finds empathy there, that her ability to speak like a human came to stand for her ability to feel empathy. So that one detail, it's actually just one word in the Greek, speaking like a human, ended up kind of forming this huge amount of architecture for the novel in terms of how I was thinking about Circe, Circe's empathy, her ability to connect with humanity, her alienation from her family. So I always love using the sources like that and sort of allowing them to grow organically and kind of feel what feels right for the character. Another thing that I thought a lot about is I was really interested in Circe's witchcraft. And I was really interested in her witchcraft as distinct from her divinity, as those being sort of two separate things. Because as a goddess, Circe is basically nothing. She's a nymph. She's the lowest of the low. The Greek gods were incredibly hierarchical. And, you know, up here, you have Zeus and Poseidon and Helios and Hera and Athena. And if you were one of those gods, life was pretty good. You could do pretty much whatever you wanted. But then you have all these levels kind of going down. You have the, you know, the river gods and the graces and the winds, and at the very, very bottom, so weak that they're basically human, you have the nymphs. And in Greek mythology, nymphs were the characters who were treated as pawns or as prey. And yet, when we see her in the Odyssey, we see a character who has a lot more independence than that and a lot more power. And I thought, well, how did that happen? How did she get from being this character who has almost no agency or control over her own life, who's the type of character who usually in a story gets turned into a stone or a bird or a tree? And how do we see her as this powerful witch? And I thought, well, the answer is witchcraft. And I was really interested in sort of how witchcraft functioned in ancient mythology and in the ancient worldview. And witchcraft was very different from divinity. Divinity is, you know, you snap your fingers and it happens. But witchcraft is based in knowledge, it's based in practice, it's based in trial and error, passion, dedication, knowing what herbs you have to harvest, how you combine them, you know, when to harvest them, all of that stuff. And so basically what I began to sort of realize as I was thinking about her witchcraft is this is an art. That's what this is. This is a vocation. And she's good at it because she works at it. You know, this isn't some magical Shazam power that comes to her. This is something that she gets good at because she's really, really good at studying it. And so from the beginning, I thought about Circe as an artist, that to me, this was always the novel of a woman who is an artist and who has this craft that she works at and works at and works at, and that's how she comes to her power. It's through this thing that she learns to do, that she teaches herself to do, that she's passionate about. So if any of you have read the sections where Circe first learns her witchcraft and sort of gains her power on the island of Aiaia, the description of her kind of developing her skills in witchcraft, I did not mean to be a reflection of my writing process, but when I read back over them, I was like, throwing things out and starting again, this sounds awfully familiar. So I definitely identify with the idea of sort of, you know, witchcraft as a stand-in for any sort of art, any sort of craft. And I also love, you know, herb lore and digging into ancient herb lore. So that was a piece of the story that was really a joy for me. I was also really interested in kind of looking at Circe's story on its own. One of the things that is so notable about her story in the Odyssey is how little of it there is. She's really just a cameo in the Odyssey. She shows up for kind of 2+ books of the Odyssey, and then Odysseus sails away, and that's it. And so I wanted to reverse that. So Odysseus, if anyone is counting, shows up for 2+ chapters of the novel, and that's it. I really wanted to keep him contained because the focus for me was on all the things that happened to Circe before she meets Odysseus and all the things that happen after. And that, you know, he and she occupy the same space in each other's lives, which is not a very large space. And I really enjoyed kind of giving her full, you know, the full scope of an epic stage for her to live on with gods and monsters. I enjoyed digging into the psychology of things that don't get answered in the Odyssey about her, like why is she turning men into pigs? That was one of the most stunning, you know, omissions I found in the Odyssey, is that Homer never tells us why she's turning men into pigs. Odysseus never asks her. And so it's just sort of treated in later versions of her story. Maybe this is why she's treated as such a villain in later versions, as like, well, you know, women, you know, they'll turn you into a pig if they can. That's just what women do when they have power. It's sort of treated that way, as opposed to, this is a really extreme thing to do. And why might someone choose to do it? And how would they get the power to do it in the first place? Oftentimes when I talk about Circe, people will ask me, is this where we get the expression, you know, men are pigs? And the answer is no, it's not. Because the idea of sort of, you know, that kind of cliche is that, you know, pigs are bad and men are bad, therefore men are pigs. That's like the little loop that phrase is running in. But the Greeks didn't think about pigs as being bad. That's actually sort of coming more out of Judaism and Christianity. You see the idea of pigs as being unclean animals, or animals associated with demons, or negative animals. In Greco-Roman mythology, oftentimes pigs are even associated with goddesses. They're sacrificial animals or sacred animals. And so what Circe is doing in that moment in transforming men into pigs is actually quite mysterious, and really something that I enjoy digging into and trying to imagine why pigs, and why is that her response to this moment. So so if anyone out there was wondering, no, that's not where it comes from, because pigs were not actually negative. And we can see actually that there are all kinds of rituals and stories about pigs and goddesses. The story of Aphrodite and Adonis, with the boar who gores Adonis. There was a festival to Demeter where they threw piglets over a cliff. So there are all kinds of interesting sort of associations there. And so it really is, it goes unanswered. And then the final thing that I was thinking about, and then I'm going to go to questions, is that I was thinking a lot about who gets to tell the story and whose story gets to be told. So I mentioned how popular Odysseus is. Actually, the BBC recently did a sort of survey, a listener survey, of what is the greatest story of all time. And the Odyssey won. The Odyssey won, and then the Iliad was like, you know, number 16 or something. The Iliad had to take a far back seat to the Odyssey. Then there were a bunch of others in between. But I was really interested that the Odyssey won. And I think largely the Odyssey won on the strength of Odysseus. And he has become hugely popular. He's the smart one. He's clever. He's an underdog. For so much of the Odyssey, he's struggling against these enormous odds against him. I think he also has a very relatable story, that he's longing to get home. He's longing for his family. In Greek, what he wants is his nostos, his homecoming. And nostos is the Greek word for homecoming, and we get it in the English word nostalgia. Nost is the nostos, homecoming, and then the algia is pain. It's the pain we feel when we long for home, or we think about home, or we remember home. And so he wants to get back home, and he worries he never will. And I think that that is an almost universal human feeling like, am I ever going to get back to my people, to my place, to the place where I belong, or am I going to be lost out here on these waves forever? And on top of that, I think Odysseus also has a really great wife. I mean, Penelope has been propping Odysseus up for 3,000 years. She's so smart. She's so interesting. There's so much about her story. She's also an artist, a wonderful weaver, just as clever as Odysseus is. I would argue that Homer actually makes her more clever than her clever husband. And, you know, she, although she's not out battling monsters, she's at home holding things together, which is its own kind of heroism. So I think all of that has made Odysseus very, very popular. But in the ancient world, Odysseus was not so popular. In fact, usually outside of the Odyssey, he was the villain. The ancients saw him as a backstabber, as a liar, as a politician, a manipulator, a puppet master. They were like, you cannot trust him. So the Odyssey is the most positive portrait really that we have surviving of Odysseus. And it's not that positive still. You know, as we talked about with him being a pirate, most of the other versions of Odysseus from the ancient world are quite negative. And so it's interesting to me how sort of perceptions of characters can shift over the years, and whose story, you know, gets kind of lifted and picked out and identified with, and whose doesn't. So part of what I wanted to do when I was looking at Circe's story is really make this her story, is sort of go into the Odyssey and say, okay, Odysseus, you've had 3,000 years to tell your version of the story. Let's look at Circe's. And the more I studied the Odyssey, the more I began to feel that I was kind of being almost invited to do this. Because not only is the Odyssey, you know, kind of the male heroic tradition, which is focused around traditionally male stories, but also the Circe episode itself is actually narrated by Odysseus in the Odyssey. And I knew that, but it began to really click for me as a novelist what that meant. So Odysseus tells the Circe episode to some people that he's staying with and trying to impress. And once I realized, this story starts to look really different. Oh, there was this terrifying goddess, and she totally got the jump on my men, but then I tamed her, and then she threw herself at me, and she was super hot. And that's basically the story that he tells. And he says over and over again how fabulous she is, and how golden she is, and how much she helped him. But what he's really saying is, look how great I am. Right? A goddess was in love with me. A goddess, you know, helped me. And so as soon as I realized that, I thought, okay, let's strip that away, Odysseus's self-aggrandizing, and what might that moment look like? So it gave me permission to say, not have my Circe kneel at that moment where the two of them meet. I thought, you know, yeah, that's how you make yourself look good, Odysseus, but how might that look from Circe's perspective? How might that have really happened if we didn't have the great spin doctor of ancient Greece telling the story? And so it kind of gave me this way to say, if Odysseus is not telling the story, it might look quite different. So there's a lot more I could say about mythology or Circe or even the writing process, but I'm gonna pause and see if there are any questions about there, because I would like to talk about what you all actually want to hear about.
Okay, Madeline, what we did was had people submit questions ahead of time. So Linda printed them out, and so I've got them. But first of all, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to come. It just really makes the whole process of a town-wide read just that much better to have the author come and talk about it. So I do have a list of questions. We'll see how much time we have. But I thought it was interesting you talking about the power play, because I had read in an article in the New Yorker a number of years ago that the emperors, they feared their adversaries, of course, but they feared the poets most of all, because the poets would tell their history and their story. And so that's very clear with Odysseus being the one who's able to tell his story and spin it a certain way. So great observation. So one of the questions, first I was like, why Ceres? But I think you addressed that enthusiastically. But can you talk about the process for finding Circe's voice before you began writing?
Absolutely. The voice is one of the hardest parts for me. That Cersei took me 7 years, and the first 5 years of writing were just me searching for her voice. I think when you have a first person narrator, the voice is so vital because all the characterization, all the story, everything has to be in that voice. And I come out of a theater background, so I really need to be able to hear that character as if they are talking to me. My friends who are in theater joke that I'm like a method writer. I have to kind of wear the character and write from inside the character. And I think there's definitely something to that. And the way that I do that is completely messy. And it's just me sort of trying things out and throwing them away and trying them out and throwing them away and trying to dig deeper and dig deeper and dig deeper into this character and really sort of feel my way through. It's a little bit like, I'm not a musical person, but it's a little bit like tuning an instrument where you're sort of, I'm listening for something, I'm listening. And then at some point I get it. Usually it takes me getting the first line of the novel kind of gives me the note that I need, and then I can go from there. But that took me 5 years. And there is a lot of, just chaos in there. And at the time, I couldn't even say what I was reaching for. Now, in retrospect, I can say what I was reaching for. But I think I wanted a voice that was at once extremely direct and honest and earnest and very open, because that's sort of who Cersei is. But also Cersei has this wryness to her, and she also has this kind of alien formality to her speech a little bit that comes from living for hundreds of years and being born in the halls of eternal beings and having uncles who have crabs in their beards and things like that. So sort of having this very strange, fantastical, alien old world that she's connected to. And so I wanted both of those things to be there, that directness, that openness, but this kind of strange quality to her speech, almost archaic in terms of some of her language. So I had no idea how to articulate that to myself. I just had to kind of find it organically.
Well, it certainly comes across because the dialogue is great. And her answers sometimes are just so funny in a different way. Okay, another question was, might you address how reading Circe, if one has not read the classics, could be a different experience? And was it important for you to make the book appealing for an audience who may not have been familiar with the characters and the myths?
Absolutely. It was really, really important for me to feel like I was writing for everyone. And I think that in this case, actually, I'm once again kind of going back to the ancient Greek epics, that the Iliad and the Odyssey, these were stories that parents would tell their children and grandparents would pass down. They were for everyone. And I really wanted to honor that. And I didn't want anyone to feel like they had to do homework before they could read the novel. And having, I hoped that if you knew the Greek myths, there would be lots of goodies in there for you. But if you didn't know the myths, that maybe this could be a way into them. Because I also know that there are some people who feel very alienated by them. My best friend growing up, who was like a sister to me, absolutely hated Greek mythology, and she thought that I was totally weird for liking it, and she was like, I don't understand, this has no relevance. And we had an infamous conversation at some point where I was enthusing about the Trojan War, and I was talking to her about Agamemnon, and she was like, if you say the name Agamemnon to me one more time, I'm gonna lose it. And I was like, I'm sorry. But for her, it felt very alienating. It felt like this old fusty world where the names were long and complicated and hard to pronounce and hard to spell, and it didn't mean anything. It was this fantasy world. And so in some sense, when I was writing the novel, she was in my mind when I was writing Song of Achilles and when I'm writing Circe, because I sort of want to make the case for, this is for everyone. And you don't have to feel alienated from this in case you do. And if you feel at home here, you're still at home here. So that's a really key part. As a side note, my friend was lovely. And even despite her her desire not to get involved in these things, she did read Song of Achilles, and she called me up and she was like, I get it now. So she is a lovely person that she said that.
One other person asked, which of the ancient Roman and Greek writers of mythological stories do you like the best?
Oh, that's such a good question. And so hard for me to pick. I think I have to say, I mean, probably if I had to choose, I would choose Virgil and the Aeneid. That the Aeneid is really underpinning so much of my thinking. I think Virgil is the great humanist. And although he is imitating, so the Aeneid is sort of the Roman answer to the Iliad and the Odyssey, Virgil was attempting to kind of write the Roman version after all this cultural anxiety that the Romans had about not being as good as the Greeks. You know, this is Virgil's attempt to write the great Roman epic. And he was doing so much as he was writing it. Speaking of the emperors, the emperor was, you know, breathing over his shoulder, saying, "What are you saying about my ancestor? What are you saying about my ancestor?" So Virgil had there was a lot of pressure on him as he was writing the Aeneid. But the way he finds humanity in characters and the way he sort of sees the tragic failures of human nature, but also hope in human nature, is really powerful for me. So I think Virgil is one. I also love Sappho. I mean, her unfortunately, Sappho's poetry is just in tatters. We really don't have, you know, most of the poems we have are just fragments. But if anyone wants to read some truly beautiful, stunning language, Anne Carson's translation of Sappho's poems, which is called If Not Winter, is beautiful. And, you know, sometimes you just get 2 words in a poem, and that, you know, but it's worth it.
Another person had the question, did I, excuse me, did I interpret correctly that Circe concocted a mixture that could change herself into a human?
So I'm gonna try to avoid spoilers here, but my 2 things. One is that as a writer, I believe that as soon as my book is in the world, it belongs to the readers as much as it belongs to me. So however you interpret the ending is correct. I think what I wanted to do with the ending as I was writing is I really wanted to end on this leap of faith that Cersei has spent so much time questioning who she is and what her place in the world is, and whether or not she's allowed to have a place, and what that home might look like for her. You know, she longs for homecoming just as Odysseus does, except she doesn't. She has to sort of make that home for herself. She has to learn to trust her power and trust her voice and trust her understanding of the world. And so in that moment, that final moment, I wanted to end on Cersei believes that she knows what she wants and she's going to reach for it.
Interesting. What was the decision process of making Hermes the predominant link between Circe and the gods?
I mean, Hermes is such an interesting character, and in mythology, I mean, and he was always a favorite of mine growing up. I love how he already moves between worlds. One of his epithets is psychopomp, which is not, you know, which means like psyche in the Greek means soul, and pomp means leader. So one of his jobs is that he leads the souls into the underworld. So he already crosses boundaries. He moves between the world of humans and the gods. He's the messenger who Zeus sends down to, you know, pass messages to Aeneas or whoever, and then he carries the souls to the underworld. So he really moves between the 3 realms, back and forth. And so he seemed to me like this perfect character to kind of be the communication with Circe, because that's already his role in mythology. But also, I think he is very intrigued by people who are different, and he's a very curious figure. And so Circe would have sparked his interest. Here she is, you know, one of the first witches inventing witchcraft. I think he would have been interested in sort of needling her, understanding her, needling her some more. So he's, you know, he's a very I think he would be a very difficult person to live with long term, but certainly very fun to have over for an evening.
And I think too, the ways he pictured in your book, Circe looks upon him as unreliable. I mean, that's what she says to her son, because Hermes has, of course, talked to him and encouraged him to go find Odysseus. So he's not a reliable person, but I think she kind of enjoyed his company early on.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think he is much preferable, at least certainly more entertaining than most of the gods she's known. And I think Circe is always yearning to learn about the world, and Hermes provides, you know, he's been all over.
Right.
He's intensely curious, as she is curious. And so I think he becomes the way that she begins to learn about sort of the wider world outside of her father's halls and outside of Aiaia. So I really enjoyed writing those scenes between the two of them, because I think I tend to agree with Circe's take on him. He is extremely unreliable, but he can also be, you know, quite interesting.
I'm looking, people are putting questions in the chat, but I'm going to go with the ones we have here. I thought this was interesting, especially in relation to the end of the book. Did you intend for the book to prompt the reader to ponder issues of mortality and immortality?
Absolutely, I did. I think one of the things that I find really interesting is how the ancient Greeks themselves and the Romans too questioned what it meant to be a god. I think it's, you know, oftentimes the gods were, as I said, extremely cruel. And we see Virgil, he's not alone in doing this at all, but we see very strongly in the Aeneid that Virgil is sort of looking at the gods as almost like political figures, that they become almost like metaphors for people who have been lifted to so much power that they have, you know, no, basically they're like gods. There are no sort of stops on their behavior. And so partially I wanted to look at sort of death and what it means to be immortal, and what it means to be amortal, and what would happen if that mortality was taken away. And what's interesting about this is that there are lots of psychological studies that they've done about this, that apparently having no sort of repercussions or societal checks on a person's power and behavior is really, really bad for humans. That what happens to us if we sort of get put in a position where we have ultimate power, and there are no repercussions or no societal checks on us, is that we start to lose our empathy. And we start to think, well, I'm up here because I deserve it, and you're down there, it must be because you deserve it. So it's fine if I step on you, because it's just the natural order of things for me to be up here. And what they have found is that you can fight against that impulse. It's something that happens naturally to humans, but you can fight against it if you remember a time when you didn't have power, if you remember a time when you felt powerless. And the sort of fascinating coda to this is that people who have experienced a lot of trauma in their life have a natural buffer against that happening to them, because their powerlessness is always with them. It's something that they remember very easily. So that was something I was thinking about a lot. I hadn't actually read all those studies when I was working on Circe, but I had read some of them, and thinking about not just sort of life and death in terms of the gods, but the ability to grow and change, which I think is one of humanity's greatest strengths. The ability to feel empathy, and the ability to sort of remember to connect to other people, and how that what happens to the gods is they become stagnant, and they're no longer able to grow. They're no longer able to connect to other people. They're no longer able to feel empathy. And this is a very old story. I mean, that's basically the story of King Lear. You know, King Lear is this 80-year-old king, and no one has told him no since he was a kid. And the first time someone tells him no, he blows up his family and has an epic tantrum. And then he has to kind of come back to himself as a human. And he says, you know, in those scenes where he's lost and raging on the heath and the storm, he says, you know, I have taken too little care of my fellow humanity. I haven't thought about them. Now I realize I'm just like them. I'm not actually better than them. And so King Lear is actually able to come back and sort of rejoin humanity. But gods don't change. They aren't capable of doing that, or they don't want to. And so it was fun to navigate. It was very interesting to dig into all those ideas about sort of what happens to us when we become like gods, and who is able to kind of come back to empathy and connection and humility, and who is not.
And I do remember Circe seemed to oftentimes, when, especially with her son and with Odysseus, look at them and imagine them as old people, or imagine their deaths, or foresee their deaths. So she's very much in touch with that aspect of humanity. So I think she does have an empathy for the humans, and she wants to be part of them, even though she does have her other foot in with the other gods. So she's like Hermes, goes back and forth. What impelled you to write this particular story at this particular time?
It was just, I had no idea the whole time that I was working on Song of Achilles. I was working on Song of Achilles for 10 years, and I had no idea Circe was waiting for me. I was completely focused on Achilles and Patroclus and their story. And then I finished that book, and it was kind of like Circe had just been waiting since I was 13, and she was like, hello, it's my turn. And so I wasn't even thinking about it in any, there was no moment where I was thinking like, well, who should I write about next? What would be good? And oftentimes in sort of publishing, I hear people saying like, well, this is hot right now, so I want to write about this. I was not thinking about that at all, because I have learned that I can only write about things that I am completely obsessed with, and they may not be hot in any way, but that's what I'm obsessed with. And so I think for me, Circe in some ways came right out of Song of Achilles, that Achilles' mother, Thetis, is also a sea nymph. She spends the whole novel and the whole, her whole role in mythology is that she desperately is trying to keep her son alive. And she seems very powerful because she's a goddess, and the story of Achilles and Patroclus is centered on humans, but she still isn't able to save her son. And so in many ways, I think Thetis and Circe, by the end of their respective novels, would have a lot to say to each other. That, I think Circe in some sense kind of flowed out of that.
And so one of the big questions also in the chat room is what comes next? So Achilles, Song of Achilles went to Circe, and one person in the chat said Penelope. What about Penelope? Is that the next, or are there any other mythology inspired novels in your pipeline?
Maybe. I love Penelope. She is one of my favorite characters. Knowing that she was waiting for me in the last quarter of the novel was a delight. In some sense, I was writing towards those scenes with Circe and Penelope for the entire novel. So I'm with you. I love her. But I also think I may have said what I wanted to say about Penelope. I'm not sure I'm going to go into her head, but I will never say never. I mean, she's such a brilliant, interesting character. Right now I'm working on a short story that's inspired by Pandora. She's kind of like the Eve of ancient Greek mythology, like, oh, if only women weren't so curious, everything would be fine. And so I'm interested in her story. And I'm also really interested in the Aeneid. I've talked about that a little bit today, that there's some part of me that would like to get to the Aeneid, but actually the theater part of me is the one that is taking over for this next novel. So the next novel is actually inspired by Shakespeare's Tempest. So Shakespeare, I mentioned King Lear. Shakespeare is another love of mine, and theater is a love of mine. So I'm excited, but I again think that there's kind of a natural connection. The Tempest is also about magic and witches and islands. So right. I feel like there's a strong link to Circe.
Oh, okay. And one other person wants to know about your research process for the book. And they really get down to brass tacks, like, did you create an outline for this book before you wrote it? And I was wondering too, as I read it, how much you studied herbology, because you really talk about a lot of different things, and how hard Circe worked at her craft.
Yes, so I did not make an outline. I feel terrible admitting that as a high school teacher, but I did know what my ending was. I knew where I wanted to end the novel. And then I sort of knew that there were a few basic portals that I wanted to pass through. I knew I wanted to pass through the Minotaur myth, and I knew I wanted to pass through a scene with Medea, and I knew that Penelope was there at the end. So I guess in that sense, I had kind of a mental outline. I knew that there were certain stops along the way, but I had no idea who Circe would be when she got there or what she would do when she got there. I just knew that they were kind of like little doorways that I wanted her to walk through. I did a ton of research beforehand, and then I also do a lot of research along the way. So for example, all the weaving stuff I didn't do until I got to those scenes. And when I got there, then I did kind of like a deep dive into, loom technology, ancient loom technology. Only 1% of it made it into the novel. You're welcome. But I always feel like I like to research as I go. The other thing I do a lot of researching is I do a lot of researching material culture. So things like daggers, jewelry, cups, armor. Almost all the physical objects that appear in the novel are inspired by actual finds that we have from Mycenaean or Minoan Greece. They're not always exactly the same find, but they're inspired by a find that we have, because I think that's really important to kind of get the physical textures of the world. And then in terms of herbology, yes, so I have always loved my librarian mother is also a huge gardener. I have like 1/100th of her gardening ability, but I have grown up around gardens. And my mom used to always take me to all the botanical gardens. I've been to botanical gardens in every city we've ever gone to. And I loved the physic gardens. Those were always my favorite part of the botanical gardens, the gardens that were, about medicinal herbs. And so that's something that I've had an interest in for a really long time. And so it was really fun to get to dig into, how did the ancients think about certain herbs? How do we think about them? What are the things that I could bring in? What are the poisons? What are the medicines? All of that. And all the herbs and plants that I mention exist somewhere in ancient literature. They're referenced in some sort of ancient mythology or some ancient text somewhere. The spells I made up entirely on my own. We don't have any spells from the ancient world, other than ones that were written by people who were trying to make them like, and then the witch harvests the liver of a young boy, that like, it's like those types of things. They're meant to scare people as you read them. So we don't have any ideas about what people, used for that. But I looked at some recipes that we have. And I also just kind of invented them. So I would think about how the ancients thought about a particular herb, and then I almost wrote the spells like I was writing poetry. I sort of let myself free associate a little bit based on what I knew about the herbs. So they're like my little miniature poems.
So like the the witches in Macbeth with their
Yes.
Any advice for aspiring novelists?
Absolutely. So, I think that the biggest piece of advice that I needed to hear when I was writing is that everyone has bad drafts, and sometimes not just one, sometimes like 50 bad drafts. And when you go to a store and you read a great book, or you go to a library and you take out a great book, the job of the author is to make it look easy, and it should all just flow as if it, they put down their pen and this golden story came out of it. But it takes a lot of work to make it look that easy. And I think, what I would say to writers is don't be afraid of a bad draft. When you write something down that's been living in your head, there's this natural sort of frustration that happens where I wish it looked as good as it looked in my head, but that's just part of the process. And so don't be afraid to, just keep working on it. Every time you touch that draft, you're making it better, you're learning more about it. People will often sort of try to chart their book in terms of how many words they have. Like, oh, I wrote 10 pages today, or I wrote, 10,000 words today or whatever. I think that that can sometimes be misleading because it represents writing as a linear progression, which is not what writing is at all. There, you know, constant wrong turns. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a book is delete 50 pages, and all that is okay. So I think just normalizing the amount of editing, rewriting, the amount of just sitting with, gosh, this isn't right, but I don't know how to fix it. Well, I'm just going to keep hacking away at it. My old Latin teacher used to say that the people who succeeded in classics were the people who had the greatest tolerance for failure. And I would definitely say that writing is similar, that having a high tolerance for sitting with your own mediocrity is very important, but it's normal. That's what everyone does. So you don't even have to, you know, you don't have to feel bad about it. All your favorite writers are doing that.
And how many years did it take you? You said is it 7 years to do
Yes.
Circe?
Yep, 7 years for Circe and 10 years for Song of Achilles. And there's a novel I wrote in college that will never see the light of day that was absolutely awful, that was not about mythology at all. It was about something else. Anne Patchett talks about how when you're writing a novel, you turn on the taps and you have to kind of let the sludge come out before you get to the clear water. So that first novel was my sludge novel. But I think that that's absolutely right, that, you know, sometimes you have to kind of let it run for a little bit to get to the good stuff.
Linda, is there time for just one more quick
Sure.
question or?
Sure.
Okay, and this comes from one of our committee members. What do you hope readers take away from the novel?
I hope that they I mean, it almost feels presumptuous for me to answer that because I want them to have whatever journey they have. But I guess I hope that that they have a journey, that it offers them something something immersive. It takes them to a different place, and you know, I'm always just very grateful that readers are willing to spend time in my world. I feel like that we all are incredibly pressed for time, and that, you know, committing to a book is a serious commitment. You're allowing your brain to go into this other world, and you're living in this other world. And so I'm just grateful that people want to read my book. So you can do whatever, you can have whatever experience you want with it.
Need to go into another book than to dwell on everything going on. So thank you so much for just a wonderful book and a wonderful talk. And I'm sorry, I can't go through the chat, but Linda's ready to wrap it up, I think. So thank you for your time so much.
Thank you. This was such a treat. Thank you for all those amazing questions, everyone out there. Thank you so much for facilitating this and for the lovely introduction. This is such a pleasure.
I just have to ask you, are you still teaching high school students?
I am not, sadly. I have kids of my own now. And so between that and writing, one of those things had to go. So I'm on pause for teaching, but I try to speak at high schools as much as I can because I miss it very much.
Those are some lucky students to have you as a teacher.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. What a great group.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely night.
Oh, you too. Thanks so much, Madeline.